The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar session today. My name is Shelley James. I guess I should put my video on so you guys can see me. Hi, there I am. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing here at Exciting. Today is our final XAMS Support Pack 17 update webinar, where we are focusing on simplified management of authorization roles along the organizational structure with non-level and level fields. Our presenter today is Alessandro Banzer, our SAP Security and GRC expert. A couple of things to mention before we get started. This is one of several new webinars that we're working on for this year. Please watch for our upcoming announcements in our Exciting LinkedIn page and from our Exciting newsletter. If you're not signed up for the newsletter, let me know and I'll send you a link to the registration. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can use the questions panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. Just type in your questions, we'll keep an eye on them, and then at the end of Alessandro's presentation, we'll try to answer all of those questions. This webinar will be recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording from GoToWebinar. Later, you'll receive an email from our marketing team to follow up and make sure you got all your questions answered. If you have any additional ones, please send them back to the marketing email or to me at sjames@exciting.com, and we'll help answer them offline. Now that we have those items covered, I'm going to hand things over to Alessandro, and he's going to walk you through today's session. Alessandro.
Perfect. Thank you, Shelley. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Before we start, as always, just a quick introduction. Who is Exciting? What do we do? Who we are? And where we're from? So Exciting been around since 2008. We're founded and still headquartered in Switzerland. We have offices throughout Europe. We're in Germany, in the UK, in Romania, and also since 2016 here in the United States. We are an SAP Gold partner. We have different recognized expertise statuses, for example, in governance, risk, compliance, data security. So different status that we have as SAP. And also all of our solutions, especially the solution that I'm going to show you today, the Exciting Authorizations Management Suite, all our solutions are fully SAP certified. That means everything that we do in following SAP's best practice, SAP's guidelines. So we're also certified for the S/4HANA public, for the S/4HANA private cloud. So if you're a S/4HANA private cloud customer and you want to have tools installed, we have all the certifications, so you can install the tools with no problem. That also means, and you only solutions are only certified if they follow 100% SAP standard. We're also SAP education partner, so we do a lot of SAP trainings, developing trainings, holding trainings for SAP or together with SAP. And as of today, we're like 120 employees, so we're growing globally. Just so you have a little bit of an idea who we are and what we do. Obviously, we focus very strongly in SAP security. Our core business is around roles and authorizations management, and that's where we want to jump into today. And I want to show you a few new things that came out with the latest support package of the Exciting Authorizations Management Suite, or in short, XAMS. So whenever I say XAMS, I mean the suite of tools that we have that has different modules that do different things. So the XAMS at the end of the day consists of 7 different modules where we can, if you've watched and followed us in the past, you've seen different webinars where we basically provide tools from designing, blueprinting roles directly in the system, where we have validation capabilities to do, simulations before we even build roles in PFCG. We have tools to implement roles in PFCG, so meaning when it comes to the authorization work that you do traditionally in PFCG, we can support that, make it easier, make it more efficient. We have a lot of automation capabilities in form of replication, mass tools, which we're also going to see today. We have different type of, or have one code scanner where we can scan different types of ABAP code, custom code, partner code, SAP standard code to find vulnerabilities in code, making sure your custom code follows those guidelines that it should. We also have then different tools when it comes to monitoring your role, your authorizations in the system, but also beyond that when it comes to security parameters, the entire security configuration of an SAP system, including the underlying SAP HANA database, can be monitored with our tools. We also have integrations into CM tools, so if you have any CM tools for IT event monitoring, we can also integrate with that. So different tools do different things, from role implementation, role testing, but then also all the way to making sure that those roles that you implemented are continuously checked and validated in your entire landscape. Today we're going to focus on how can we mass replicate or mass manage organizational values in roles. So basically talking about derived roles, but in a better way of doing derived roles. And what we're going to see today will be as part of the role replicator, which is one of the 7 modules. Role replicator is all about replication, all about doing everything in mass, so a lot of time savers with the role replicator. And one small piece of the entire role replicator is the management of organizational values. That's just one piece. There's 100 other different reports and mass features that we have in role replicator. The organizational values obviously a core feature, very powerful, and that's what we want to go and take a look today. As Shelley mentioned, if you have any questions, just use the questions panel in the GoToWebinar control panel. Just type them in. I try to answer them throughout the webinar, or then if I don't see them on the go, we'll catch them up later. So what are the challenges with organizational values? What are the challenges with derived roles in general? The way that we can manage organizational values is very limited. It's very inefficient, especially if you're just using PFCG. There's not very many mass features. We now have the ability of PFCG massval, the mass transaction of PFCG, where we can do certain mass changes to roles. That is very helpful to some extent, but still always a case-by-case replication that we can do. So we can update, one value in 10 rows or 100 rows. That is possible. That's a big time saver already, but it's still, one-by-one situation where we can do changes. Organizational values, when we maintain them without PFCG massval, just directly in PFCG, or even with PFCG massval, we're very limited of what we can do. So it's still very time consuming. From most of our customers that have global implementations, that deriving roles is always a big challenge. Also, at the same time, if you don't use any tools, very often what happens is we kind of lose the overview. So there's no great reports that show us, what is in the derived roles, how do they function. They don't have really references that we can use. So it's all very manual to making sure that all the derived roles are in sync and built the way they should be built. So a lot of challenges. So what do we provide with the XMS? And for those of you that have used the XMS in the past, you obviously know this. But what we can do with the XMS, and I'll also have here a couple of slides to just quickly show you from a high-level perspective what we do. At the end of the day, what we do is we're able to build an organizational structure in Role Replicator, and then we can use that organizational structure to replicate to the derived roles. The organizational structure needs to be built. We have different ways how we can build the organizational structure. We can use EC01 data import, so we can directly export the structure of your ECC system and pull it into the Role Replicator. We can manually create it. We can use mass features like from an Excel file basically and upload into the tool. Different ways how we can build that org structure, and we'll see how that looks like here in just a minute. And then from that org structure that we have defined, in that org structure, we define all the org values and also now non-org values along that org structure, and then we can use that org structure to replicate to our derived roles. That basically means we have the master data is the org structure, and then all the roles follow that org structure. That also means we have the org set as kind of like as a master, and we can always see if any of the roles deteriorate from that structure, And if they're out of sync, we'll see that here in a second as well, we can, go ahead and, bring them back in sync, and making sure that all our derived roles always follow the target, which is the organizational structure that we have built. For the org structure, we can do single changes, which I will just show today, where we just make a few changes manually. We can obviously also do that in mass, and then see how we can replicate hundreds of roles basically by the click of a button. So let's take a look. So how does it work? So obviously what we need is the org structure. So that org structure that needs to be defined first. Like I said, there's different ways how we can do it with an import, or we manually created different ways how it can be done. But that's the foundation of what we need, so we can then go ahead and replicate. How does it look like? It's pretty straightforward. So basically we can build one or many organizational structures. So here I'm just showing one, but you can have, maybe if you have different business units, you want to have different org structures. We can also build different ones. But here in a simple example, one built for exciting. So basically we have an organizational structure built for exciting. And then we have here, you can see we have kind of like, it's called it 2 branches. We have the US, and then I have Mexico, just as an example. And we can see for the US, we have a organizational set group, so we can group different organizational sets. And then under US, we have 2 what we call org sets. We have one for US 1 and US 2. That could be your location. We have Miami, we have Tampa, Florida, we have maybe New York or Philadelphia, whatever we have, we build different org sets. And then in those org sets, we define the org values. We can define the plans, the company codes, divisions, any field that we want to define in that org set, we can define. We can now, with Superpack 17, we can not only define org values, we can also define non-org values that then will be written back to the role. That's one of the newer things we can do. But historically, it was just the org values, and that's very often really what we want to do from an org replication perspective. Now, what does that mean? So we have org sets, and we can build a hierarchy as deep as you want to build it, or as large as you want to build it. We have different, we have basically 2 different type of entities. We have the org set, and then we have the org set groups. So groups is basically just a grouping of different org sets. And the org sets, they hold the organizational values, or the authorization values are basically maintained in the org set. Now, what can I do from a replication perspective? So we basically have we call it template role. That's our master role or parent role, however you want to call the role. And that's the role that we derive from. So we have the parent or master or template role, however you want to call it. And then the derived roles are basically, instead of maintaining them one by one, we assign the org sets or org set groups to those derived roles. So for example, we have here an accountant role that we then derive into different accountant roles for a global. Here I didn't update all the names, but we derive for Mexico, for the US, for all the org sets or org set groups that we have. And then instead of maintaining the org values directly in the derived role, we use the org set. So basically we are going to assign an org set or an org set group to that derived role. So with that role here, if we assign the org set for Mexico, then the org set Mexico defines the org values into that role. So if there's plant and division, for example, then that org set will supplement basically those org values into the derived role. We can also assign org set groups, or like here the entire exciting, where we have basically everything. And then obviously we'll take all the authorizations from underneath from that org structure. We can see it here for exciting. We have 2 different plans and 3 different divisions. But just go back one to the previous slide. We can see here exciting is all the way at the top. We have Mexico, there's plant 1000. We have under US, we have US 1 with plant 2000. And we have different divisions from Mexico and from 2 different US org sets. We have different divisions. And so basically that hierarchy can be used. So we can assign the org set to the role, an org set group, or even the top level org set group can also be assigned. And then all these groups or org sets will supplement the org values into those derived roles. That's the concept behind that entire org set application. I hope that makes sense so far. So let's just take a quick look in the system, how that looks like. So I'm just going to our main transaction, which is the exciting all transaction. I'm here in an S/4HANA in a demo system that we have. So not the best data quality, but we'll have a couple of good examples. So I'm just going to the role replicator tools here. You can see here when I'm in the role replicator, we have different tools. That's what I was mentioning before. We have different tools for roles. We have tools for org set, tools for users, for ABAP objects, for Fiori. Everything in here is about mass creation. Everything should be done, super fast. And today we're going to look at is just the org set replication. You can see here we have different reports. I don't want to go into all the details. I just want to show you the core functionality, and then also want to point out what do we have new with support package 17. The first thing, and that's the foundation, is the org set structure. So that org hierarchy that needs to be built, and that's just what needs to happen first. So let me quickly go in here. You can see here I have two different org set groups. I have one for SAP and then one for exciting. Let's just take a quick look. So under SAP, and it doesn't correlate to what I had in the slides, so don't get confused here. So here we have an org set group for SAP. We then have different org set groups for Americas, for Asia Pacific, Japan, Europe, Middle East, Africa. And if you look into Americas, we have USA, and then under USA we have 3 different org sets, one for Newtontown, New York, and then for Central Finance. And if we just open, for example, New York, we can then see under New York we have different org values maintained. So here we have the company codes, purchasing group, and so on, maintained specifically for New York. Now, what can we do from our roles perspective, and we'll see that here in a second. We can now either assign the org set for New York to a derived role, we can assign the org set group for USA, or the org set group for Americas, or the org set group for the entire SAP. And obviously, the higher the group, the more organizational values will be, will be loaded into the role. So for the org set group, for the org set New York, the company code is 2,200. If I have Newtontown, we have 2,100. Obviously, if I would do the org set group for USA, then the company code would be 2,100 plus 2,200, plus we even had a third org set, 2,000, that's the same, 2,100, will be loaded into that derived role. And you can see here different org sets. So, for Europe, same thing, with Switzerland, Germany, just the entire organizational structure is basically represented in the org hierarchy that we can see here. Now on the back side of this, if I just change the view here, we now can see all the master, parent, or template roles, however you want to call it. We call it template roles. So you can see here, let me just make this a little bit smaller. You can see here we have different template roles. So these are our master roles that we then derive. So for example, we have one here for a controlling master key user role. And you can see for that controlling master key user role has been derived a couple of times. So like 8 or 10 different derivations. And you can see these derivations here, they have now org sets or org set groups assigned to them. So for example, here for the Australia key user, we have an org set group, and that's the org set group for Australia. Others we have derived based off an org set. So here different org sets, for example, Sydney, and Sydney obviously is underneath Australia. So, we can use it in one or in multiple. That's obviously always possible. So that assignment needs to happen. Obviously, we can do that here one by one. We can manually maintain, we can must maintain. making sure that those org sets or org set groups are assigned to the derived roles. All that obviously just needs to be loaded. Or then if you have new org set, we can just mass replicate for new org sets for all our template roles as well. So all that obviously can be done in mass as well. What we can see over here, and this is why I like this a lot, we have an overview. So we can see here, for example, for my org fields, what's the status. And I can see here some are red, some are yellow, some are green. What does that mean? Green always means good. So for example, if you go into this one here, we can see all my derived roles are great. That means they're all defined the way they should be. That means the actual role follows the target that comes from the org set. Over here, for example, for Australia, or then for Melbourne, we have an out of sync situation. That's why it's red. That means the org sets hold different values that the roles currently have. So that's good to know, but we can also compare. So let's just say here for Melbourne, we do a quick comparison, and then we can see, okay, so what's going on here? We can see what's in the parent role, in the master or template role. You can see here, these are the values. We can then see what are the values that the org set for Melbourne holds. So we can see here all the values. That's basically what's maintained the org structure. And then we can see what does that derived role at the moment actually have. We can see here the profit center. There's an out of sync situation. So in the role right now, we have an @ symbol, but the org set actually says it should be 00001. Why is that? That's because someone changed the org structure and it hasn't been replicated back to the role. So we have an out of sync situation. That's what it shows here. Obviously, because it's for Melbourne, it's also for Australia. So if you would compare the same thing here for Australia, we can see the same thing. And obviously here it's an org set group for Australia, whereas Melbourne and Sydney and different locations in Australia. And we can also see here the same thing. So basically Australia, there's a new profit center that hasn't been replicated just yet. So what does that mean? If you have an out of sync situation, we can automatically sync that. So we can automatically update the derived role. I can do it one by one. I can do it in mass here for all my roles. That's all possible. So if I say here, if I double click here and say synchronize, then it would just update that Melbourne role. So let me just do that. I just double click here. I get a dialog that asks me if I want to write the derived role into a transport. Obviously, that's what I want to do, because if I do a role change, I have to transport it up the chain to production. So that needs to happen. I just skip that here. And you can see different ways how we can do it. We double click, it takes a second or so, and then that role is updated. And the screen then will refresh. So we see here one role has been replicated. And now if we reload here, we can see Melbourne now is yellow. And the yellow in this example is good, because the yellow just means, and I can quickly show you that, the yellow just means that we have fields that are in the parent role that we have not defined in the org set, and therefore it's taking the values from the parent into the child role. We can see that here. So for example, the work center, it holds an @ value in the parent. That's how we do it, because we don't want to have a star or open value. So we just put the @ in, the value that doesn't exist, so that the role is properly built. We don't have any open values. Plus, we don't want to have a star either, unless we specifically want to have a star, then yes. But we don't want to put stars in there if that's not really what we want for all the roles, because obviously, as you can see here, if the org set doesn't define the work center, this example, it will then just replicate the @ value down to the child role. And that's why it shows the yellow. That means, we just have some fields that are not defined by the org set that we're using for that role. But everything else is in sync. We still see we have Australia, very still out of sync. So we would also have to synchronize that here, where we can do just one derived role, or we could do it up here on a higher level for that master role, and we'll just synchronize all the ones that need to be synchronized below it. Or then up here, I can synchronize the entire list. So everything here where we have a red will then be updated directly into PFCG. So obviously this is great. So we have here a great overview of all our apparent roles, and we can see, you know, if there's anything out of sync. That's a great overview to just have. But now what's the benefit of using the tool? The benefit is obviously as soon as there's changes, whether it's a new org set that we have to define, then we have to replicate all these roles, we can do that in mass. Or there's a change to an existing org set. Let's just quickly simulate that. So if you go back to the org set hierarchy that we saw earlier here, and let's just stick with the example with Australia, because we have a couple of roles which we just saw it. And let's just say there's a change. Let's say we do a change in Sydney. There is maybe a new plant, or there's a new sales group, or whatever the case might be. Let's just say we do the plant. Let's keep it simple. We say here we add a new plant like 3201. So we basically update the org set for Sydney. So basically I did an update for Sydney. That means all the roles that have the Sydney org set assigned, they're now out of sync. All the ones that have Australia are out of sync. All the ones that have Asia Pacific Japan are out of sync. And all the roles that are assigned to SAP are now also out of sync that use the plant, because it's always, you know, derived upwards as well. So let's take a look. If you go back, we change the view here again to see that. Now just comparing all the roles. And if I make this a little bit smaller again, because my screen is a little small here, we can now see the one row we just had before. We now have an out of sync situation. We have it for Sydney. We can see it here. We have it for Australia. It hasn't been replicated for SAP or for Asia Pacific. That's why it's just the two. But also here again, we can do the comparison, and then we can see here, oh yeah, here the plant, there's a new plant, so there's 3201 that's not currently in the role. And then again, the same exercise as before, I just start syncing back to PFCG, making sure all the roles are properly synced. Let me quickly do that once again. Just say we don't write to a transport. And then that's done, perfect. And now just to also prove you, if we use the Sydney role, but just double click here on the role name and we go to the authorization. So you see here, this is the key user role for Sydney, derived from the master. We go into the authorization data, just to quickly show you as well, just to prove that the tool really works. We can now see here, we go to the organizational levels, that now the plant here has been updated. What's the other one that we updated? I think it was the profit center, wasn't it? Oh no, not the profit center, something else. I can't remember which field it was, but here we can see now the plant, obviously, that's now here. So the 3201 now has been replicated back to the role. And that's ultimately what we do with the org set replication. Just go back here. So first of all, we can maintain that org set structure, and then we can mass replicate, you know, back to PFCG. Now let me just quickly go back to the slide deck before I jump back there. So that's the core feature of what we do in the org set replication. So there's now a few new things that came with SP17, which I think are very, very helpful. The first one here, the append mode, that's just a customizing setting that we can set, where we can basically define, or we can define that the org values that are not defined in the org set, then they will be used from the parent role to basically append. So what that means is we can define values in the parent role, and then we can say in the customizing that if there's a value in the parent role, it's always automatically appended to the derived roles, even if I have values in the org set. What does that mean? Let me quickly go back here. That means if I have a parent role up here, sorry, the parent up here, and in the parent we define, let's say the plant, we define the plant as 5,000, and I activated append mode. The the org sets that I have, for example, for Mexico, defines the plant as 1,000. With the append mode, if I have 5,000 up here in the master, it will replicate the 5,000 to the derived role plus what comes from the org set or the org set group. So that ultimately means that the derived role would have 5,000 that comes from the master plus 1,000 that comes from the org set Mexico. That's what that append mode does. So basically, we can now force values from the parent into the child. That's possible. Before it wasn't possible, it just override, it just took the values from the org set if there were values. If there were none, then as we saw earlier, they were automatically brought down to the child. So that's now basically where we can append values from the parent also into the child, even if we have values that are defined through an org set or org set group. And that needs to be activated in the customizing. The second thing here, and I think this is one of the biggest things that we have now new with SP17, is we can use references in the org structure to build the org sets or org set groups. That ultimately means that if in the past you replicated a lot of values because based on your structure you defined, and then you had to replicate them a couple of times because you had the same values here as you had there and there. You had to maintain that in different places. So let's say you had it replicated 10 times in your org set structure, and then there was a change. You had to go into 10 different places to make a change. Now what we can do is we can use references. That means we can define org structures and then reference them back in a different position in the org structure. Let me quickly show you that. So we can see here, if I close this again, so we have, for example, let's say this is our org set group that we use. That's the ones that we assign to our roles. And here, we remember we have different regions. And then let's say I have certain values that I'm defining across the board. So let's say I have certain values that I always define for Europe, Asia, Americas, and they're always the same. Could be like maybe from sales or depending on how you have your business set up. And we're going to use them from this org set group down here where it's called total. So we can see here we have different org set groups, for example here for Switzerland, and here you can already see it. So basically here we have now referenced org sets, so we can reference from another org set. So for example here under the org set group B1000 we have an org set that defines certain values, but then we also have a referenced org set from another place. And so here, this is basically from global, which is down here. So this one here, what's defined here is now also under the org set group B1000. So we can do cross references within that org set structure. And that's helpful for very specific use cases. That makes a lot of sense to have that reference. So we don't have to maintain the same values over and over and over and over again. That just really simplifies the maintenance of that org structure. I hope that makes sense. And then again, here you can see it's reference. That ultimately means if you go in here and you make a change, you're actually changing that referenced object. So if you make a change here, it will make the change actually down here because it's a reference. So you can, it's always reference back there. And you can see it here, if I open all these up here, you can see that same org set here has always been referenced in all the org set groups. We can use it again in multiple places without maintaining it individually. That's actually the goal there. What we now can also do with support package 17 is we can also define non-org fields to be considered. That means if we have certain authorization fields that we want to push down to derived roles because we want to change them there. There are instances where that makes sense. Mostly, probably not, but then there are specific use cases where it makes sense. We can also do that. So we can also, and let me quickly show you that, instead of just adding, and let me just go back to my Sydney one that we had here. So instead of just adding org fields where we can just add fields to the org set, we can now also add non-org fields. Okay, so that could be something like class for, you know, as user group. I'm an IT guy. That's the only authorization object I really know. You know, if it says user group, there we have the class for the user group. I mean, that's not an org field, obviously. And we can then also say here, for all those derived roles that now have Sydney, let's put the class, the user group, in there as Australia or Sydney. And we can even then limit it to just, for example, the S user group object. And then here we can say, okay, the user group should be Sydney. That means if all the roles where we replicate and that field can be maintained, it will basically maintain the value now as Sydney, even for non-org fields. So that actually goes beyond the derived role concept. But again, in a lot of cases, in certain cases, this also makes sense. The user group could be something like that. If we have, you know, with SU01D, if you can, you know, look up users, but you only want to make sure you only look up the users in their region where they are. This could be a use case where we can also do that on that level. Again, the fields obviously we can be any field that has or any will update any object that has that field, or we can then limit it to one particular object. Like here we say, okay, only for S user group I want to update that class field. That's now also possible. I'll just cancel here, but that's also possible. So that's also new with support pack 17. And then we have a couple of different reports. You know, for example, we have one to find the unnecessary role assignments because based on the org structure, the authorizations are already covered from a higher hierarchy. So we can also find stuff like that to reduce the number of roles assigned to use at the end of the day. That's also different types of reports that we have available. Just to quickly maybe show you just a quick overview. Don't want to really run the reports here, but if you go back to the, oops, that's too far back. Let me just go directly to role replicator. You can see here we have, you know, different types of reporting as well. You know, with, you know, redundant role assignments, that was what I was just mentioning, but also different reports to find unassigned derived roles. So if you replicate a large organization, replicate a ton of roles, and there's just, you know, a ton of roles that are not assigned, maybe, you know, it makes sense to, you know, to just remove them. Because oftentimes we just, you know, especially when you just start with role replicator and do that, you just say, let's take all the parents, all the master roles, and let's just derive for all the childs possible. And then you realize half of them not even used. So why bother? Let's just remove them. So we can also find stuff like that to find unassigned, you know, derived roles, and then, you know, even take it out here from the replication tools. So different type of reporting. Obviously, we also try to make that a little bit easier. That's in a nutshell. Let me quickly see. There was a question in the chat. Let me just quickly open it up here. Actually, there's more than one question. Just 1 second. My screen is a little awkward here. Yeah, so there was a question about the transport. Let me quickly show you that. It's a good question. So basically, when we replicate the role, as I was showing you earlier, let me go back to the replication tools. So let's say we go here again, and we do a sync here. I think that was the question, where, you know, here it says write replicated objects into a transport automatically. Now, obviously, if I click OK, in the next screen, it will ask me for the transport. So I still have to define the transport that I want to use to move those roles. It doesn't just automatically select the transport. You always have to define it. But now, obviously, all the roles you replicate in that process will be added to that transport here. So that's just that. I hope that makes sense. Perfect. Then we have a few more. Let me just really quickly. Yeah, and regarding the reference groups, if you can have more than one, yes, you can. You can, you know, create as many as you want, and then you can reference them as many times as you want. That's also possible. And then regarding the replicated non-org level fields if it makes them go to status changed. As far as I know, I'm 99% sure that we don't change objects to status changed. So they will only be changed if they're in maintainable status. I'm 99.9% sure that we're not going to end up with a changed authorization status if we replicate non-org fields. So that means we would only update the values of fields that are maintainable. I hope that makes sense. So it will not change a standard proposed value from SP24 and then make it a changed object. We won't do that. So we really try to remain in SAP standard. Perfect. I don't see any other questions unless you see one, Shelley, but I think we're good. So let's just quickly move forward. So I hope that was, just a quick overview what we do with role replicator for org values. I think very, very interesting. This kind of concludes the SP17 updates that we had. If you have any questions, even for other tools that we maybe haven't covered, these are the biggest use cases, the biggest changes that we have seen. Just reach out to us. I mean, you have my email address here in 2 slides, or just reach out to us. We'll get them answered. We have one more webinar scheduled for next week. It's the first time that we're hosting it on LinkedIn. So I have the link here, and let me also maybe just post it into the chat. So we just have it in the chat here. So if you guys want to register, so it's basically a webinar that we're hosting on LinkedIn. So you can just sign up on LinkedIn, and then it's the same webinar, the same way as we always have them. Just run them through, very educational. We're going to talk about SAP Fiori security, so basically covering the basics about Fiori security, what you need to know. We'll see how it works. First time we do it with LinkedIn, as I said. If it works well, then we'll have multiple ones on LinkedIn. Otherwise, we'll go back to the known format here on GoToWebinar. Also to mention, we have a lot of on-demand webinars available. So if you just go on our website, we have tons of webinars. Pretty much everyone that we have done in the past, they're recorded, so you can watch them. Just follow the link here, and you can watch them all online. With that being said, if you have any need for services, we offer obviously a lot of consulting services for S/4HANA migration, security audit, implementation of security concepts, different type of optimizations, RFC redesigns, with traditional ERP redesigns. Just reach out to us. Here you have my email address, or then Shelley as well. If any questions, just let us know. With that, Shelley, anything else that I forgot?
No, just thank you. And everybody remember to watch for information regarding any upcoming sessions. Again, we'll update that information on LinkedIn and in our newsletter once it's available. And like I said, if you don't get our newsletter now, let me know, and I can send you the link to that. There is the YouTube playlist that all of our webinars are on. And if you need the link to that or the registration for the online on demand for those, let me know. You can reach out to Alessandro or myself at sjames@exciting.com, and let me know, and we'll send it out again. Every session will be part of the playlist. If you have a link, bookmark it, and you can use it over and over again. It'll get updated about 48 hours after the webinar. We'll upload each of the sessions, and we're looking forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.